I'm Chad Husby. I'm Chief Explorer at Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden, and I'm going to take you on a tour of the Tropical Plant Conservatory at our garden, where we have some extremely rare tropical plants and delicate plants that need some protection from cold and need good water. We water them with reverse osmosis, a very pure water like rainwater. And this is a very rare aroid from Southeast Asia, probably Borneo. We aren't really sure exactly where it came from, but it's, we found it in the nursery in Thailand. It's a Homalomena that has this amazing variegation, natural variegation pattern, where it has dark green parts, very light green and intermediates, and gives it a great camouflage effect on the rainforest floor. And it even is flowering right now. And it's an aroid, so it has flowers that have a spathe, this modified leaf that goes around the outside. And the central part, a spadix, which has a bunch of little tiny flowers on that column. And all the aroids do something like that, no matter how different their leaves may look. All right. And we have a whole bunch of other interesting diversity of plants here. And another thing you see in addition to camouflage patterns on the rainforest floor are iridescent patterns. This is a plant called Mapania, which is a sedge also from the areas around Malaysia and Borneo that has this amazing blue color. It's actually due to layers of silica on its leaves that reflect the light in a way that it looks blue. But if you were to grind up the leaves, there would be no blue that would come out because it's not a pigment. It's just the way the leaves reflect the light. And we have some other very beautiful plants from Southeast Asia here, including this Ardisia, which makes these wonderful clusters of tiny flowers that are just about to open up, and many of them have very dark leaves and different leaf patterns. And we have, this is one species, and we have two others here. And this one has a few flowers that are coming out. And these were all grown from individual leaves. Some plants you can take just a leaf and plant it and wait a few months and baby plants will grow up, and this is one of those types of plants that you can do that. So it's each one of these you could make a whole colony of new plants. And this conservatory we're in was actually, it's been here since 1968. And we have some interesting historic plants. This is one that was collected by David Fairchild himself, who the garden is named after. He was a great plant explorer in the earlier part of the 20th century. And this he collected on his expedition to Southeast Asia, the Philippines and the Spice Islands in Indonesia in 1939 and 1940, just before the beginning of World War II. And this plant was from the Philippines, and when it's flowering, it has these beautiful salmon-colored bracts and that surround these little columns of flowers in the middle, and so puts on quite a spectacular show. And this has been growing here since the early 40s. It's pretty amazing. So he collected in 1939, sent it over, and then planted it in the garden a few years later. And it kind of illustrates a fascinating aspect of plants is that they don't really age like animals and like humans do. So this plant we've just taken cuttings from it and been propagating it, and it still grows like it was just collected yesterday. And but it was collected, over 80 years ago. So it's a pretty amazing characteristic of plants that if you take care of them, they can live as long as you like. They could potentially live forever. And so most of the plants in here are flowering plants, but we have some really ancient types of plants. This is Selaginella magnifica from the Philippines. That's actually grows by spores like ferns, but it's even more ancient than a fern, and these little structures on the end are cones that produce the spores. And it's a survival from really ancient times in the plant world, and so has this beautiful branching pattern that's very unlike most other kinds of plants. But it's very endangered in the wild, but due to people who were propagating it, it's now something that's being grown in various collections all over the world, so it's safe in horticulture and shows what a difference an individual gardener can make. You can grow a really rare plant and ensure its survival into the future. And we have some other really unusual plants hanging here. This is a very strange cactus from the Brazilian Amazon, and it's flat. It actually looks like a tongue, and it's growing up this board made of tree fern fiber, and it's Strophocactus wittii, and they call it the moonflower because it only flowers one night a year. And Margaret Mee, who was a botanical illustrator at Kew Botanic Gardens back in the 80s and 70s, she spent about 20-some years trying to catch this in flower in the Amazon. So she would go back every year around the time when they flower. And so after 20 years, she still hadn't done it, but then just a few years before she died, she was successful and was able to catch it in flower and spend all night illustrating the different stages of its flowering. And so it's pretty amazing plants and she made some incredible, beautiful illustration of this plant. But fortunately, because our colleagues at the Marie Selby Botanic Garden collected this in the 1970s and shared cuttings, we all are able to grow and enjoy it now. Another very ancient plant in the conservatory here is this very, very long one. It's over 6 feet long. It's Phlegmariurus dalhousianus. It's a lycophyte, a lycopod like the Selaginella, but looks quite different. And it's the longest one of all the lycopods that grow in the tropics and are epiphytes, grow in trees. This is by far the longest, and it's one of the hardest to grow. And we're really pleased to have this. A really great fern grower named Charles Alford was able to grow this successfully and propagate it and share it with us. But one of the things it does as an ancient plant is it only branches from the tips. It's called dichotomous branching. So you get this very symmetrical pattern where there's a branch, a split there, and then another split, and then another split. So it creates a very symmetrical, even look to the plant. And we have many other representatives of that group. Call it the lycophyte lineup along here. So these are very ancient plants. They go back to the earliest days of vascular plants, plants that get bigger than mosses in the world. And another one of those very ancient plants that is quite interesting is this Selaginella here that's got a color like chocolate. It's from Ecuador, and it's Selaginella articulata. And it comes in different color forms. This is one of the darker forms. It also comes in green and various in-between colors. But once again, it's showing this fan shape where the branches split by dividing at the end, whereas the more modern plants, the more recent flowering plants, they will make branches everywhere a leaf joins the stem. It can make another branch, so you can get a much more complicated branching pattern, whereas these make a very even fan shape. And now we're moving into another part of the conservatory that's a little cooler, and it's actually only covered by a screen, so it gives a little more air circulation. So things in here are things that don't need quite as much protection. This is a really neat ginger. It's Alpinia rugosa, and it's from the island of Hainan in China. And it naturally has these very wrinkled leaves, and they're very velvety underneath. It feels just like a velvet, very pleasant. And it has really spectacular flowers, though it's not flowering at the moment. But this was being grown by horticulturists for a long time before it was described by botanists. So it was sometimes gardeners bring interesting plants to the attention of those who then go on to give them a name and describe them and enter them officially into the list of all the world's plants. And this fern that's growing in among it is from Taiwan, and it's very unusual in that most ferns and most plants have leaves that just grow to a certain point and then they stop. This fern, Dunsteadia scandens, which I grew from spore from Taiwan many years ago, it has its individual leaves can grow indefinitely, and they behave more like a stem. And as you can see here, they keep growing. They expand their normal side parts, and then they are continuing to unfurl indefinitely. And a single leaf can get 30 feet long. So we'll see how long they get in our conservatory eventually. And we have this plant is called the blue ginger, even though it isn't a ginger. It's in a different family, and it isn't quite blue. It's more purple, but interestingly enough, in the plant kingdom, true blue color is very rare, any blue pigment. So most pigments are purple, or sometimes plants are blue, like the one we saw, the Mapenia, that has a certain structure that causes the light to be reflected blue. And we have another Selaginella that does that here. This is the peacock moss, they call it, Selaginella uncinata, which also is, it actually doesn't have a blue pigment, but it has these layers of wax that reflect light in certain ways and bend the light so it comes back and looks blue. And this area is where we grow a lot of rare gingers and ginger relatives. And many of them have wonderful patterns on their leaves. And some of them have wonderful scents. This ginger, Zingiber Rayne from Southeast Asia, when you cut the leaves or the stems, it smells just like licorice, like anise. And then it's used in cooking in Southeast Asia a bit, and then it makes these very interesting flowering structures at the base that look like little honeycombs. And we also have some, this is another ginger, a Berbigia from Borneo, that actually has leaves that have a certain iridescence of their own. They kind of have a shiny reflecting character based on the layers of structures on the surface and the way the cells are configured. And this amazing palm we have here is the double coconut. It actually produces the largest seed in the world. It's from the Seychelles Islands, and it makes these enormous fan leaves. And this palm, even though it's been growing here for about 20 years, it still hasn't produced a trunk. And we're eventually going to have to open the top of the conservatory to let it grow. But the seed it produces and the seed it was grown from is called the double coconut, and it takes from 4 to 6 years to develop after it's been fertilized. So everything about this palm is slow and magnificent, and we're so happy to have one growing here. It's a little sensitive for South Florida conditions, but in this conservatory, it's really been able to thrive and show how wonderfully large it can be. But they only come in male and female, so separate. So we won't know for many years whether this is a male or a female. We hope it's a female, so we can then get pollen from another garden that will allow us to produce our own double coconuts here one day, which would be the great dream. It's the only place it's been done in the United States is in Hawaii. And they got their pollen from Singapore, so it's often, botany and horticulture are often an international collaborative endeavor, so we can do much more together than we can individually. And we have yet another Selaginella from Southeast Asia here. That is iridescent blue. That's Selaginella wildenowii. And it even has little bits of purple at the ends of the growing tips. But once again, it's due to the way the light is reflected, there's no blue pigment in it. And we have some interesting aquatic plants from the tropics here in these ponds, and including these little conifers from New Caledonia that are growing, 2 of them in this back pond. They look a little bit like pine trees, but they're related to the Podocarpus, which is fairly well known, its relatives. But these are some of the only aquatic conifers, evergreens, trees that produce cones. Most of them don't like to be anywhere near water. These grow in rivers on the island of New Caledonia in the South Pacific, and have this remarkable natural bonsai pattern that they grow into being really nice small trees. And New Caledonia is this island that's full of very strange plants. It has all these very wonderful tropical conifers, and it's kind of almost like a land that time forgot in the South Pacific. So we're glad to have some of these really rare plants from there. And we also have some wonderful aroids here. This one with wonderful depressions in its leaves, the corrugated leaves. This is Anthurium veitchii, which is from South America and is one of the most famous aroids, and has been for a long time because it's got such wonderful texture to its leaves. And we also have another kind of contrasting aroid right next to it with big arrow-shaped leaves. That's Cerdosperma johnstonii, and that one will actually grow right in the water. So the Anthurium veitchii grows in trees naturally, high in the air with a lot of air circulation. And aroids can also grow with their roots sitting right in water. So it's an extremely diverse group of plants. We also have a very unusual representative of another really ancient group of plants, the Cycads, which are plants that produce seeds, not spores, but they don't produce flowers. This is Bowenia, and it has leaves that are a lot like a fern. They don't look like what normal cycads look like because they're 3 times pinnate, so they're divided. Each of these is divided 3 times, so it's divided once, and then twice, and then 3 times. And they only grow in Australia, and there are only 2 species in this whole genus, so we're really happy to have one of them represented here. And we also have a really spectacular, another Selaginella, Selaginella picta, that is from Vietnam and has these amazing contrasting leaves between the white and the green, gives it a striped appearance. And it's the only Selaginella that I know of that has such a dramatic contrast in its leaves. And then behind we have another really spectacular leaf pattern that's growing up the wall here, 2 of them actually. The really lacquered leaves are Piper ornatum from the region around Indonesia. It has these kind of whitish pink veins and likes to climb trees. It's in the same genus as the plant that produces edible pepper, but this one does not produce pepper. And then growing next to it is a Bowenia, which is in the bean family. This is a vining one, which has wonderful lighter colored veins on top, and underneath the leaves are beautiful purple. And some plants have leaves that move, and it's often called nyctinasty, like night movements. And this plant is getting pretty much getting ready to go to sleep, because in a couple hours those leaves will fold and it will look like quite a different plant, so you won't be able to see they'll actually go like this and you won't be able to see the purple underneath anymore. And they do that every night. And another plant with some amazing leaf texture is this plant that's in the tomato and potato genus, the Solanum, and we're not sure what the species is yet, but it's from Ecuador. And the leaves have these purple hairs that are extremely velvety, and as you turn it, you can really see the purple as the light reflects from those hairs, whereas the leaf underneath is a dark, dark green. Then the plant we brought in from Southeast Asia, from some of the nurseries there, is this Dracaena stardust, which has this amazing pattern of lighter colored spots among the green, and it was made by a legendary horticulturist in Indonesia, Gregory Hambali, who hybridized a couple of wild Dracaenas, one of which had really good spotting on its leaves and one of which had really big leaves, and this hybrid has the best of both parents, and it's produced a spectacular plant with great coloration. And we're very excited about this plant is a Schefflera, which in the same genus as some of the most popular houseplants that are very easy to grow, the Scheffleras, but this one from southern Thailand is actually very hard to grow and very, very rare in cultivation, but we're excited to be actually producing some fruits for the first time after growing it for about 4 years. So we're harvesting those and trying to make more, because this is a very, very slow and difficult plant to grow. So we're going to try to have more so we can share it with other gardens and other people who enjoy plants. But the leaves have a very corrugated texture, and they're very thick and have a lot of hairs on them. So it's a really dramatic leaves on this Schefflera. And fairly new addition to the conservatory here is this beautiful little plant. This is a Simarouba glauca. It's only found on Puerto Rico, and it's a beautiful small tree that grows along rivers there, and it produces these wonderful flowers very early in its life, and these really shiny leaves. And this one may someday have potential as a new houseplant, because it seems to have just the right proportions, and it can do well in shade, and has nice waxy leaves, which probably means it can take some lower humidity. It was introduced by Dr. Alan Miro, who used to work at the U.S. Department of Agriculture Plant Introduction Station down the road where David Fairchild used to work. So they've done a lot of work bringing in these wonderful new plants to cultivation. And just above it is this plant, Syzygium verstigii, which is a tree with enormously long leaves that grows in New Guinea. And they grow a few of them in Hawaii, and they shared fruits with us, the Waimea Arboretum, and we're hoping to have quite a spectacular specimen in a few years. It's already pretty spectacular. And the new leaves come out and they droop down almost vertically on the end of that. and show you an interesting fern here. This is a Diplasium species from southern Thailand, and it's quite lovely and a big fern, but one of the neat things it does is it makes baby ferns on its leaves. And each of these little tiny ferns is a clone. It's an exact copy of the parents and has roots and can fall off or be removed and make a bunch of new ferns. So this whole leaf is producing a little colony of the ferns now that it's touched the ground. So this can produce, and this can reproduce by spores. It has very nice spore patterns under the leaves, which would create variation, genetic variation through sexual reproduction, and then it can reproduce asexually by cloning itself with these baby fernlets that grow directly from its leaves. It's a very flexible plant. And this is an interesting begonia from, I believe this is from South America, and it's Begonia solimutata, and its name has to do with the fact that the leaves will change their color under different lighting conditions. So apparently that if you lay something on top of half of the leaf for a half hour, an hour, that part of the leaf will get lighter colored because the little chloroplasts that do the photosynthesis will move to the sides of the cell and change the color of the leaf. And another very strange plant phenomenon we have on exhibit here are these ant ferns from Southeast Asia, Lechinopterus. They're a fern that has a symbiotic relationship with ants, and they have these stems, these rhizomes, that look something like coral. And they have hollow areas, and the ants are able to live in them. We don't have the ants that are associated with them living here, so they don't have the ants in them, and they can live without them. But in the wild, the ants protect the ferns, and they also help fertilize them by bringing various things that they feed on that decompose around the fern and give it some extra food. So it's a very interesting way for a fern to live in association with insects. And this is another ant fern here with a different kind of rhizome, a flatter one. It's a different species. And we not only have plants that have vascular tissue, the ones that will grow big, like we're all used to, the trees and the plants like this, the much softer ones, but we also have some bryophytes, which are like the mosses and liverworts, and this is a very special one from South Asia. It's Marchantia Liverwort, and it's what makes it really look neat is the fact that it has this dark line in the center of its little phalli here, which are the stem-like structures. They aren't really stems, but because bryophytes don't have the tissue that will conduct water higher, like ferns have that kind of tissue that allows them to grow taller, they tend to only grow very low unless they're in incredibly humid environments. And but also they only branch by dichotomizing like the ancient vascular plants, so they make these beautiful patterns. And I have some of the interesting representatives of a group of plants from Southeast Asia, the Medinillas, that have really beautiful, just known for their really beautiful clusters of flowers that hang down. They tend to grow up in trees or on rocks in nature, and we've tried to simulate that here. And actually they've been a kind of plant that's really been discovered for horticulture and as houseplants recently. And in fact, in Europe, and especially in the Netherlands, they're actually doing a lot of hybridizing of them and a lot of developing of new forms. This is one of the species, but there are all kinds of new exciting hybrids with different flower colors and different leaf forms and different habits coming out of different nurseries. So we're really excited about having more of those on display. And a very unusual plants, one of many. We have a lot of kind of specialized and unusual plants here. This is Stegolepis, which grows just like a fan. It grows, it's extremely flat, and extremely wide, and the leaves are pressed together very tightly. But when it flowers, it produces these little structures that are very spiky and very three-dimensional. And when these first come out, they're actually covered with a clear mucus that lubricates them for pushing their way through these really tightly pressed leaf bases. So it's a very interesting adaptation to growing folded so tightly, but then having these very different kinds of flowers. This is from Ecuador. There's a relative of this that grows on the tepuis of Venezuela, these rock islands in Venezuela, that actually is iridescent blue also. Has the layers on the leaves that bend and reflect the light, so it comes back blue. So we're hoping one day to be able to grow that one. A few of the plants we grow are mainly grown for conservation, and this one is an example of that. This is a plant that very recently went extinct in its home of Puerto Rico due to Hurricane Maria in 2017. There were only a few trees left. It's called Solanum encephalum. It's a relative of potatoes and tomatoes, and it has flowers that are very similar to potato and tomato flowers, but it's a small tree or shrub. And this was actually growing here at Fairchild until 2005, when it was destroyed by the two hurricanes that hit us that year. But fortunately, a horticulturist, a graduate student from the University of Connecticut, had taken cuttings before that for his research and brought them up to the university. And they have had this growing in their collection for teaching ever since. And when it was discovered that these were all destroyed in Hurricane Maria, people in Puerto Rico were very excited, the botanists there, to know that it was still alive in a collection up in Connecticut, of all places. And they since sent us back some plants that were rooted from cuttings, so we can also keep it here, and we're going to share it with many other gardens so that hopefully this species will not go extinct. And it shows what just a couple of people caring about a plant can do. They can actually save it from extinction, because for this plant to survive, one person had to care enough to propagate it from the wild plants in Puerto Rico, to take a few cuttings, and then somebody else had to be interested in it and propagate it, take some cuttings up to another place, in this case Connecticut, because it was killed both in Puerto Rico and in Florida, and survived in Connecticut. Now it can be returned to Florida and Puerto Rico and many other places, and hopefully will never be lost to the world. So it shows what work we can do by growing plants and doing something as simple as taking a cutting. So we don't always have to be doing things on a large scale. Sometimes very modest efforts can produce very, very big results. And this, as I mentioned, this area has a very pure water, because the water in South Florida has a lot of dissolved limestone, calcium carbonate in it. And that makes it hard for us to grow certain plants like carnivorous plants and plants that require a lot of acidity. But in here we use very pure filtered water, reverse osmosis water, that has a lower pH, more acidic, and doesn't have any of the calcium in it. So we can grow some of the plants that need those conditions. Like these are tropical rhododendrons from the mountains there, and they are supporting some of the most spectacular carnivorous plants, the nepenthes, and the pitcher plants, the tropical pitcher plants, and which have leaves that do three things. These are the leaves that are just the new leaves. They have a tendril on the end that will wrap around some sort of support structure. The winged part in the back does photosynthesis, so it does photosynthesis, it wraps around, and then when it's got support and is wrapped around, it will make a pitcher. So the pitchers here are a bit old. They haven't made new pitchers this year, but those are what they use to trap insects, because they grow in habitats with very few nutrients. So what they do is they lure insects into those structures that hold fluid, that hold water and enzymes, and when the insects drown and decompose, then they absorb the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other nutrients that were held in the insect's tissues. And we have some other dramatic examples, like these much larger ones down here that are in better condition. And they come in all shapes and sizes throughout Southeast Asia. And they're very characteristic of habitats that have not a lot of natural fertilizer in the soil, so they're busy capturing the fertilizer from other areas, because often the insects move from other areas that are more fertile, so they're taking advantage of the fact that these animals, insects in this case, can move and actually bring more nutrients to them when they can't. One of the things plants can't do is move. So plants take advantage of the partnership with animals, in this case for fertilizer, in other cases for pollination is the most common. And they even partner with other creatures like fungi for their roots to help them absorb other nutrients from the soil. So plants rely on lots of different partnerships, and and animals, of course, will eat plant fruits and disperse their seeds. So plants have all these different partnerships for overcoming their being immobile. So we can take advantage of all these creatures that are mobile. And we also are growing a number of orchids here, which are one of the biggest groups in the plant kingdom. At the moment they aren't in flower, but they do flower periodically in all different shapes and sizes. And one of the most interesting orchids, just for the way it grows, is the ghost orchid. So it's growing in on this plaque here, and it almost does, it has just a little bit of stem, but it's mostly roots. You really don't see the stem, and it wraps around trees, and there are a few species in the South Florida. There's one species in South Florida and a few in the Caribbean islands that all do this. And so all that you see are these roots. You don't see any leaves, and there's a hidden stem, and then periodically this amazing flower just looks like it comes out of nowhere, like a ghost, a beautiful white flower, and that's where it gets its name from. So most orchids have leaves that you can see, but this one is probably one of the most cryptic of all. It's just, you have to really work to even see it there. So there are many, many ways to be a plant. So that's a good lesson from all this. And speaking of many ways, we're all familiar with a rose, what a rose looks like. This is a plant that's called a Siam rose. It's a ginger, Atlingera corneri, but actually the structure that looks like a rose in this case are actually not flowers. They're actually modified leaves that are colored and arranged a lot like a flower, but actually flowers emerge. The flowers are gone right now, but the flowers emerge from between those red structures and are very short-lived, but the modified leaves last for weeks and often months, and so this is much longer lasting than an actual rose. But it's a way that they advertise their much more diminutive flowers, whereas an actual rose is actually a flower. So this is, many times appearances can be deceiving in the plant world. Most of the palms we're familiar with, we think of big tree-like plants, or sometimes the medium-sized plants we grow indoors. But palms come in all sorts of sizes, and this is a little Aquala triphylla from Southeast Asia, and this is its mature size. So this would make a really good little plants in a pot, though they're fairly sensitive to dry air and whatnot. But and it's actually flowered. This is the old flower stalk and has made seeds. But so it's a naturally miniature palm, and it's growing right next to a plant with fantastic leaves. This is actually another kind of ginger in the genus Scaphoclames. And many gingers just have fairly green leaves, but this one has these really dark leaves on the surface with glossy red underneath. And then eventually, this one isn't flowering right now, but it will make little flowers from from the base. This isn't the ginger you can eat, but it's a huge group of plants in both the Americas and Southeast Asia, many of which are really ornamental, many of which are good for eating, which are good for food. And we have very interesting plants here that's actually a begonia hybrid that actually has some really neat, unusual asymmetrical leaf patterns here. So begonias come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and colors, and often provide good contrast with other plants. Show you this interesting palm over here. Now, most of the palms we're familiar with have leaves that are divided, that look like kind of feathery. They have divided into sections. This is a Johannesteijsmannia also from Southeast Asia, that is famous for having leaves that are one piece. And the leaves can get much bigger than this, and hopefully they will. But they never split. They're just this one big, beautiful fan. And interestingly enough, though, that all palm leaves begin as one piece when they're folded in the bud. But then those that leaves like this palm above me that actually are divided into segments, they actually rip apart. They actually tear apart as they unfold. Whereas this Johannesteijsmannia does not do that, so it stays in, just like it was in the bud, as one piece. It just unfolds. And then there's a fairly similar looking plant beside it. It looks like a palm and is also pleated along its length. But it's actually in a whole different family, the Cyclanthaceae, the cyclants. They call them the Panama hat palm sometimes, because one of the members is used for making the famous Panama hats. But these are very important group in the American tropics. They're only found in the Americas. And they look just like palms to those who aren't familiar with this unusual group. But then when they flower, they make flowers that look like white spaghetti coming out of them. And the flowers can often have quite remarkable fragrances too. Whereas palm flowers are all very small and fairly inconspicuous, so they can be many, many of them. It just goes to show you, many times you can walk in a forest and just look at the leaves, and it may be a little misleading. So it's good to know some botany to figure out whether a plant's appearance is actually a good indication of what its actual identity is. There are many plants that like to grow in really wet places, and so we have a little waterfall here that we grow some of those sorts of plants on. This is little Homelamina, little aroid that grows on the edges of streams in southern Thailand. They're growing here. It seems to be adapting pretty well to these conditions. And we have an interesting fern that we're growing up here that actually it's Asplenium prolongatum, and the interesting thing it does is it makes little baby ferns from the ends of its leaves. So this leaf has already made another fern here, and then that fern has made another fern, and they can form a chain all over the rock here. So it's a very interesting, and once again, these are all clones, so many plants can clone themselves, make identical copies, and cover fairly large surfaces that way. Because plants are all about growth. They can't move with muscles and whatnot like animals can, but they can move by growing. So this is a plant that's actually, in some sense, mobile. And growing up the wall here is a pretty spectacular plant from the Asian tropics also. It's Freycinetia, which is a fairly little-known group of plants that are related to the pandans. And these Freycinetias may have potential as houseplants. Many of them seem to be fairly easy to grow. They grow in low light conditions in the forest and have waxy leaves, so they may actually be something we could grow on some sort of support structure in our houses. They're pretty, they give a whole different look than most other plants. It's good for those of us who like to be adventurous in what we grow. Another of these cycads that we talked about earlier, the Boenia. On the other side, this is another one that actually looks a lot like a fern, but it's a plant that produces seeds, and it's very ancient. It's Ceratozamia urifolidia from Mexico that has some of the largest leaflets of any cycad, and that arch over here and kind of blend with the other tropical foliage. But they're really survivors of a more ancient time. They even reach back before the dinosaurs, like some of the other plants in here as well. And as with the Freycinetia back there, there are a lot of tropical plants that make good use of vertical space. So this is a Syndapsis pictus here, that it's an aroid that is a great climber and has amazing patterns on its leaves. Most of the leaves are silvery and then with little green patches, and can climb very tall in the trees. And so it takes advantage of trees in the forest as a support structure, so it doesn't have to make its own supports to climb up and reach the light higher in the canopy. And we have a similar Syndapsis that's growing up the ceiling here. And so they don't need to have trees to climb on. They can climb on walls and even ceilings. So this one is growing all over the wall and has even grown up the ceiling, and it was headed for the exit and then decided against it and is heading back. So it can even grow vertically. And their roots have an actual adhesive that allows them to stick to the ceiling or stick to walls or stick to tree trunks. So they're many orchids do that too. They have a biological glue that will hold them in place. So as long as you can get them, when we propagate them, we usually use something like fish line or twist ties to tie them on until their roots can actually get secured, and then they're very good at holding themselves up. I'd like to show you this very beautiful palm that's a little bit mysterious. This is a version of what's called the sealing wax palm, Certostachys. It grows in tropical Asia. And this one is called the Theodora Buehler palm. That was named after a lady who was growing it here in South Florida. And the typical type has a solid red stem, whereas this one has these beautifully streaked stems. This is an older one. You can still see the rainbow colors, but on the younger stems, the color is really dramatic. So it just has the rainbow streaking all up the stem. And we're working to propagate this so we can try it outside, because it's supposed to be able to grow outside as well as inside, but we need to make sure we have it well backed up before we experiment. So fortunately, it reproduces clonally, so it makes many stems in the same clump, and then you can take off pieces and root them and grow them elsewhere and have copies all over. So it's one of these amazing abilities of plants to copy themselves. So plants were cloning themselves long before we were trying to use cloning in biotechnology. So it's one of the amazing ability of plants. And in fact, plant cells have the ability to keep dividing an infinite amount of times, an indefinite amount of times, whereas our human cells only have a lifespan of a certain number of divisions, and it's only cancer cells that can divide unlimited amount of times, but plants are able to take advantage of being able to not have limits in their cell division, and they don't really have to worry about cancer. So plants are pretty amazing. They just keep growing. And this is a very, very interesting plant here that we've seen plants before that were pleated in the longitudinal direction, pleated along their length, but this one is a cyclamp, the Dicranopegium from South America. It's one of the few plants that actually is pleated in two perpendicular directions, so longitudinally, and then it has these ripples that go horizontally along the leaf. So it creates a really fairly mesmerizing pattern in the leaf, just like it was made of ripples in the water or something that were crossing each other. And this is a very rare plant from New Caledonia in the South Pacific that was shared with us by Atlanta Botanical Garden. It's a Phyllanthus species, but it's only found in a very limited area, and it was received from a nursery that was working on conservation of plants on that island. So by growing these in several botanic gardens, we're helping to preserve a really rare plant that's only found in a very, very limited area. So if something happens to it in its native habitat, we'll be able to return the plant to New Caledonia someday. So it's a big responsibility that many botanical gardens and many gardeners have who grow really rare and special plants like that. And botanical gardens also, we do a lot of introduction of new plants, and many of these plants we've been talking about are very new to cultivation. This one is also very, very new. It's we call them palm grasses, which are neither palms or grasses. They're in the genus Curculigo. But the ones that were in cultivation here for many years were just green. They looked like this structure, but all green. This one was shared with us by a nursery in Thailand, and it has this metallic purple above and a darker purple underneath. And we've had many international visitors recently for the International Aroid Society show, and many of our colleagues from other botanic gardens and other nurseries have been asking us to share baby plants of this because it makes, they clone themselves very well, and so we've been sharing this with our colleagues, and we're looking forward to being able to make this available to many more people to enjoy in tropical gardens. And it might even be something that could work as a houseplant someday. So it's pretty exciting. And we have an interesting, this is a cycad here from Central America, Zamia obliqua, and cycads, which we've shown a couple other examples earlier. They're really ancient plants. They don't make flowers, but they do produce these cones that then, they come in male and female. So this is a female plant making a female cone, and growing beside it is a male plant that its cone is long gone, but it did produce a cone, and the pollen from that cone was used, the pollen from this plant, which is making another new pollen cone right now, actually, a couple of them. But the older pollen cones produce pollen that we pollinated this female cone with, and we have a little ribbon around it to mark that it was pollinated, and then we're waiting. It takes usually a few months for the seeds to develop if the pollination was successful, and we do this by hand. And many cycads are really critically endangered. It's the most endangered major group of plants, and so it's really important to reproduce them and then share the seeds with other botanical gardens and with other growers of tropical plants so that they never become extinct, because they're very slow growing and very slow to reproduce, so they take a lot of patience. And a very rare gesneriad we brought back from Southeast Asia that has some pretty amazing leaf texture and very corrugated large leaves, but then at the base it produces these wonderful clusters of white flowers. This is kind of near the end of its flowering cycle, but it produces these flowers for quite a few weeks, and it's got another set coming along. So it's a really spectacular tropical plant that's fairly new to cultivation. And it's growing next to an interesting Selaginella, this ancient plant that's crawling along the soil here, and this is starting to change to silver because it's evening. And this particular species does something very strange. It changes from green during the day to silver at night, and it's due to the one chloroplast, the structure that contains the green pigment chlorophyll that it uses to photosynthesize. And during the day, that chloroplast is flattened along the bottom of the cell, and so you see the green that chlorophyll reflects. But at night, the chloroplast turns into a small ball and allows most of the light to pass through the cell, and therefore it just reflects this silvery color that's based on the empty space in the cell. So it's every night it does this color change, and no one knows why. So we're hoping someone will take up the challenge to start studying this someday, because there are so many of these amazing phenomena in the plant kingdom that people have not yet figured out how to explain, and there's still a tremendous amount of science and discovery to be done. And we have another amazing example of leaf texture here. This is a piper, once again related to the plant that makes our edible pepper. That plant has, the edible pepper plant has really flat, glossy, dark green leaves, but this is a relative of its from Asia that has leaves that not only have this really dramatic texture where they've got the folding along the veins, but then it's all covered with hairs, so it really has a bold appearance. And most likely the plants that have these very deep folds in the leaves, it helps the leaves be stiffer, a little more resilient. And the hairs may help to protect from excess sunlight. They may help to conserve water by keeping the air around the leaf a little more still. There's less air movement, which reduces the evaporation. So that's one of the reasons why they think this plant may have these kinds of hairs all over it, and other similar plants. Right above it is something very strange. This is actually a branch from a conifer, from what's normally a tree, Araceae subulata from New Caledonia. And but an interesting thing that happens in some plants is, even though all the cells in a plant have the same DNA, and they all are capable of, in theory, the same things, yet DNA sometimes gets turned on and off in different parts of a plant during the plant's lifetime. And so this is a branch that's rooted. We rooted it. Our colleagues at Atlanta Botanical Garden rooted it. And so it's growing and it's rooted, but it keeps growing as a branch. So it keeps growing horizontally. And people have done this with these tropical conifers, rooted their branches and just let them grow for 10, 15, sometimes 50 years. And they just keep growing horizontally. They never forget they were originally a branch, and you can see it actually got injured on this side, but it's still growing horizontally like a branch. And so it's kind of an eternal branch. And yet, on rare occasions, something switches in one of the branches and it will actually grow vertical again. And we grew one of these Araceae that did that, and no one's really sure what controls that, what will make certain plants are very difficult to reproduce from cuttings, because it's difficult to make them grow naturally again. They'll just kind of either grow horizontally or they'll grow kind of in various contorted fashions, and this is one of the most extreme, just growing horizontally. And when it does, these will sometimes make branches, but the branches will also be horizontal branches. So you can make a tree into a hanging basket plant, which is pretty remarkable.